The sterile hum of the server room was the only constant in my life, a predictable drone against the silent chaos of my own thoughts. Most days, I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of Quan Enterprises, a necessary but unseen cog in a machine run by a man who moved with the chilling grace of a predator. From my small, glass-walled office in the acquisitions department, I cataloged the lives of others, their heirlooms, their forgotten treasures, their last worldly possessions, all while feeling profoundly invisible myself. It's a strange thing to be so intimately acquainted with the stories of the dead, yet feel like a complete stranger in your own skin. My grief was a quiet companion, a shadow that clung to me since my father's passing, its weight a constant reminder of the stories we never got to finish. This particular Tuesday started like any other. A new shipment of estate items had arrived, a motley collection of a life packed into beige cardboard boxes. My job was simple: assess, catalog, and digitize. Yet, as I lifted the lid off a tarnished rosewood box, an internal statement, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the quiet of my routine. You are completely and utterly alone. The thought was so stark, so absolute, that it made my breath catch. It was then that my eyes fell upon it. Nestled amongst yellowed lace and mother-of-pearl buttons was a ring. It wasn't ostentatious, but it held a gravity that silenced the rest of the clutter. It was a simple band of what looked like white gold, aged and worn, with a flat signet face bearing a delicate, unfamiliar crest, a dragon coiled around a plum blossom branch. A strange, intuitive jolt went through me, a feeling of recognition that made no sense. I picked it up, the metal cool against my skin, and the feeling intensified. It felt like a key, but I had no idea what lock it was meant to turn. All I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, was that it had something to do with him, with the cold, distant, and untouchable Jinwoo Quan. The next few days were a descent into obsession. By day, I was the competent archivist, Alara Vance, meticulously logging 18th century porcelain. By night, I was a detective, fueled by coffee and a relentless, inexplicable hunch. The ring sat on my desk at home, its silent presence a constant question mark. I ran its design through every heraldry database I had access to, cross-referencing ancient Korean family crests and guild insignias. The work was tedious, a series of frustrating dead ends. Most crests featuring dragons were imperial or belonged to the 5 great clans, but none matched the delicate interplay with the plum blossom. It was my father who had taught me that every object tells a story if you only listen closely enough. I could almost hear his voice, a warm echo in the sterile quiet of my apartment, urging me to look closer, to see beyond the obvious. On the 3rd night, I found it. It wasn't in a formal registry, but in a digitized academic paper on fallen noble families from the Joseon dynasty, families that were erased from official records after political betrayals. The crest belonged to the House of Jeong, a family of respected scholars and advisors who were purged in a brutal coup 3 centuries ago. The author of the paper noted that any surviving artifacts would be exceedingly rare, considered curses by some and priceless by others. But it was a footnote at the end of the article that made my heart slam against my ribs. A brief mention of the family's last known descendant, a woman named Kwon Mi-kyung, who had passed away 20 years ago.
Quan.
The name stared back at me from the screen, a bridge across time connecting this forgotten piece of metal to the formidable man who occupied the top floor. It still made no sense. Why would an artifact of a disgraced family be so important? Why did my intuition scream that it belonged to him? I called my best friend, Chloe, needing an anchor to reality. So let me get this straight, she said, her voice dripping with its trademark sarcasm. You found a secret decoder ring in a box of old junk, and you're convinced it belongs to your boss, Mr. Tall, dark, and emotionally constipated? And now you're going to what? March up to his ice castle and present it to him. Her bluntness was exactly what I needed, and yet it didn't shake my resolve. I just have a feeling, Chloe. I can't explain it, a feeling, she repeated flatly. That's what you said about that rescue pit bull that ended up eating your favorite boots. Just be careful, Ilara. Guys like Quan don't just have skeletons in their closets. They have entire graveyards. The week leading up to the company's annual Christmas party was a special kind of torture. The ring, now nestled in a small, simple black box, felt like a burning coal in my purse. Every glimpse of Jinwoo Quan in the hallways sent a jolt of anxiety through me. He was an intimidating presence, always flanked by his silent, hyper-competent aide, Mr. Park. Mr. Quan moved through the world as if he owned it, his dark suits perfectly tailored, his face a mask of cool indifference. Yet, I'd learned to observe the things others missed, the subtle tightening of his jaw when a deal was going south, the brief, almost imperceptible flicker of exhaustion in his eyes at the end of a long day. He was powerful and guarded, a man who had built walls so high no one could ever hope to scale them. And I, an insignificant archivist who felt more comfortable with the past than the present, was about to walk up to those walls with a stick of dynamite. My internal monologue was a frantic loop of self-doubt. This is insane. He's going to think you're a stalker. He'll fire you. Or worse, he'll look right through you, the way he always does, and you'll feel that familiar sting of being utterly invisible. But beneath the fear was that stubborn, unwavering intuition. The ring didn't belong in a sterile archive. It belonged with him. It was a piece of a story, his story, and I was just the messenger. The night of the party arrived, a blur of polite conversation and forced holiday cheer. The main lobby was transformed with twinkling lights and lavish decorations, a warm, festive scene that stood in stark contrast to my own cold dread. I wore a simple red dress, feeling both conspicuous and entirely anonymous in the sea of expensive suits and cocktail dresses. I watched him from across the room, a still point in the swirling eddy of celebration. He held a glass of what was probably whiskey, listening to a senior board member with an expression of polite disinterest. He looked handsome and impossibly remote. Taking a deep breath, I started towards him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It felt like walking towards a cliff edge in the dark, my only guide a whisper of a feeling that this was something I had to do. Mr. Park intercepted me before I was within 10 feet of his boss, materializing so silently he might as well have risen from the floor. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Is there something you need?" His eyes were polite, but held a distinct lack of warmth, the look of a man who could and would handle any problem that arose. My carefully rehearsed words evaporated. I have something for Mr. Quan," I stammered, clutching the small box in my hand. He glanced at the box, then back at my face, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I was sure he would dismiss me, send me back to my corner of the archives where I belonged. But then Jinwoo himself turned, his dark eyes sweeping over the crowd and landing, unexpectedly, on me. A flicker of something, curiosity, annoyance, crossed his face. He gave Mr. Park a subtle nod, a silent command that had the man stepping aside. The path was clear. As I approached, the ambient noise of the party seemed to fade into a dull roar. His entire focus was on me, and for the first time, I felt the full, unnerving weight of his attention. It wasn't dismissive or cold. It was intensely observant, as if he were cataloging every detail of my nervous approach. "Ms. Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, even smoother and more intimidating than I had imagined. "They tell me you are a competent archivist." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, devoid of warmth. "I hope so, sir." I managed. "I have something for you. A Christmas gift, if you'll accept it." I held out the small box. He stared at it, a frown touching his lips. He clearly disliked breaches in protocol, especially personal ones. I thought he would refuse, but after a long, tense moment, he took it from me, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a startling spark of warmth in the cold atmosphere he created. He opened the lid. The sight of the ring lying on the black velvet seemed to suck all the air from his lungs. The stoic mask he wore so perfectly didn't just crack, it shattered. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching violently. His gaze was locked on the small piece of metal, a maelstrom of emotions swirling in their depths, shock, disbelief, and a raw, profound pain that took my breath away. He lifted his hand to take the ring, and I saw that it was shaking. His hands, which I had only ever seen as steady and sure, whether signing documents or gesturing dismissively, trembled with an uncontrollable tremor. He finally tore his eyes from the ring and looked at me, his voice a ragged whisper, stripped of all its power and authority. "How did you find this?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. The bustling sound of the party, which had faded to a distant hum, now seemed to vanish entirely, leaving us in a pocket of profound, unnerving silence. His eyes, usually so guarded and impenetrable, were wide open, and in them, I saw the ghost of a past I couldn't have imagined. The powerful, emotionally distant man was gone, replaced by someone who looked utterly and completely exposed. I had unearthed something far more significant than a forgotten family crest. I had unearthed a piece of him. My own voice was barely audible when I finally answered. It was in a collection of estate items from a private cellar in upstate New York. It was uncatalogued. The answer felt wholly inadequate, a dry, technical explanation for what felt like an act of fate. He didn't seem to hear me. He was still staring at the ring as it lay in the palm of his trembling hand, his thumb stroking the worn insignia of the dragon and the plum blossom as if greeting a long-lost friend. The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken history. I felt like an intruder, a witness to a grief so private I should have turned and run. But I couldn't move. My own history of loss, the dull, constant ache for my father, recognized the shape of his pain. It was a silent, solemn kinship that held me in place. Mr. Park appeared at his side again, his professional gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw his boss's shattered composure, the ring in his hand, and the look on my face. His own expression, for the first time, betrayed a hint of shock before it was quickly suppressed, replaced by a quiet concern. He spoke to Jin-woo in Korean, his tone low and respectful. Jin-woo didn't respond at first. He finally closed his hand around the ring, a gesture that was both possessive and protective, as if he feared it might vanish. He looked up, not at Mr. Park, but at me. The vulnerability was still there, but something else was beginning to surface beneath it, an intense, burning curiosity. The invisible wall between us was gone, and in its place was a connection so raw and unexpected it was terrifying. He finally spoke, his voice regaining a fraction of its former control, but the tremor was still there. "My office." Now, it wasn't a request. He turned and walked away, not waiting for a reply, Mr. Park falling into step right behind him, leaving me alone in the middle of the crowded room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was no longer invisible. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor was a silent, unnerving ascent. I followed the rigid line of Jin-woo's back, the small black box still clutched in my own hand, forgotten in the aftermath of his reaction. His office was exactly as I would have pictured it, a vast expanse of dark wood, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the city's glittering sprawl. It was a space that was both beautiful and profoundly lonely, designed to impress and intimidate, not to comfort. He didn't turn on the main lights, leaving the room bathed in the cold, distant glow of the metropolis below. He walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders tight with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He was still holding the ring, his fist clenched around it so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the festive noise I'd just left behind. I stood awkwardly by the door, feeling like a foreign element in this sterile, controlled environment. My intuition had led me here, but it offered no guidance on what to do now that I had arrived. I simply waited, My own grief a silent, empathetic presence in the room, recognizing the familiar shape of a world that had been irrevocably fractured by loss. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scarred by an emotion he had clearly kept buried for a very long time. "This was my mother's," he said, his words directed at the glass, at the city, at anyone but me. "It was her wedding ring. My father had it made for her, a replica of one her ancestors wore. It was the only thing she had left of her family's history." He turned then, his eyes finding mine in the dim light. The raw pain I had seen earlier was still there, but it was now mingled with a deep, consuming sorrow. She was buried with it. It was supposed to be with her. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a lost heirloom. It was a desecration, a theft from the most sacred of places. The mystery of its journey from a grave in Seoul to an estate box in New York was suddenly darker, more sinister than I could have imagined. I finally understood the depth of his reaction, the tremor in his hands. I had handed him a ghost. My role as a quiet archivist had abruptly ended. I was now the keeper of a dangerous secret, the sole witness to the chink in Jinwoo Kwan's formidable armor. He finally moved from the window, sinking into one of the large leather chairs behind his massive desk. He placed the ring on the polished surface with an almost reverent care, the small band of metal looking fragile and out of place in the landscape of corporate power. He gestured for me to sit, an order softened by the exhaustion that now lined his face. The air between us had shifted. The formal hierarchy of boss and employee had dissolved, replaced by something far more complex and intensely personal. He saw me now, not as Ms. Vance from Acquisitions, but as the person who had brought this piece of his soul back from the dead. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice regaining some of its authority, but the edge was gone. From the beginning, every detail of the estate it came from, I recounted the story, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. I told him about the rosewood box, the yellowed lace, the feeling of inexplicable recognition when I first saw the ring. I explained my research, the late nights spent digging through digital archives, the discovery of the fallen house of Jiang, and the footnote that contained his mother's name. As I spoke, he listened with an unnerving stillness, his gaze never leaving my face. He wasn't just hearing the words. He was analyzing them, searching for something beyond the facts. For the first time, I felt the full force of his intellect directed at me not with dismissal, but with a desperate need for understanding. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, his fingers tracing the outline of the ring on his desk. The cold, empty office felt charged, a crucible where our two worlds were being fused by shared grief and a burgeoning, dangerous mystery. When my phone buzzed in my purse, we both jumped. It was Chloe, her name flashing on the screen like a beacon from a world that no longer felt real. "Ignore it if you need to," Jinwoo said, his perception startling me. But I needed to hear her voice. I answered, and Chloe's sarcastic drawl filled the silence. "Are you alive? Did the Ice King thank you for the gift, or did he have you escorted out by his men in black bodyguard?" I glanced at Jinwoo, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. "Something like that," I murmured. "I'll call you back." I hung up, the brief intrusion of normalcy only serving to highlight how surreal the situation had become. Jinwoo stood and walked towards the small, discreet bar in the corner of the room. "I imagine you could use a drink." I know I could. It was in that moment, as he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, that I realized I was no longer afraid of him. The mystery of the ring became a silent pact between us. Jinwoo tasked me with a new, off-the-books project to trace the provenance of the entire estate shipment. He gave me unrestricted access to the company's private logistics records and a level of authority that made my immediate supervisor, a fussy and territorial man named Arthur Davies, raise a skeptical eyebrow. "A special project for Mr. Kwan himself?" Davies had said, his tone a slick blend of feigned admiration and suspicion. "How impressive. Do let me know if you need any assistance. I have a great deal of experience with high-value estate liquidations," He appeared trustworthy, almost paternal, but something in his eyes, a brief, covetous flicker as he glanced at my new security credentials, set my teeth on edge. I spent my days in the deep archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled vault in the sub-basement of the building, a place where the stories of 1,000 lives were stored in endless rows of gray archival boxes. But now, I wasn't just cataloging the past, I was interrogating it. Jinwoo would often join me in the evenings, after the building had emptied out. He would shed his suit jacket, roll up his sleeves, and sit across from me at the long oak table, his presence filling the sterile silence of the vault. It was in these quiet hours, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives, that the walls between us truly began to crumble. We worked, but we also talked. He told me about his mother, a woman with a gentle spirit and a fierce love for a history that had been stolen from her. He spoke of his own childhood, a life of immense privilege shadowed by the constant, unspoken burden of his family's secrets and his father's relentless ambition. I, in turn, found myself speaking of my father, of our shared love for history, of the gaping hole his sudden death had left in my life. Jinwoo listened, his observant gaze making me feel seen and understood in a way I hadn't since my father was alive. The connection was no longer just about the ring. It was about the shared language of loss, a melancholy thread that wove our disparate lives together. The air between us grew thick with unspoken feelings, a slow-burn romance igniting in the most unlikely of places. One night, while examining a shipping manifest, my fingers brushed against his as we both reached for the same document. The contact was brief, but it sent a shockwave through me. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my heart stuttering. He didn't move away. He simply held my gaze, his own eyes dark and intense, and in their depths, I saw a reflection of my own longing. Our investigation slowly began to yield results. The estate where the ring was found belonged to a reclusive collector who had passed away without any heirs. The liquidation had been handled by a third-party auction house, a reputable firm we'd worked with for years. Everything on the surface appeared legitimate. The discrepancy, I discovered, was not in the external paperwork, but in our own internal intake logs. The original log, signed by Mr. Davies, listed the contents of the rosewood box as assorted antique sewing notions, estimated value negligible. There was no mention of any jewelry. It was a small detail, one that would have been easily overlooked, but it was a loose thread. I pulled on it, working late into the night, with Jinwoo looking over my shoulder, his proximity a warm, distracting presence. I cross-referenced every low-value acquisition Mr. Davies had overseen in the past 5 years. A pattern began to emerge. In at least a dozen cases, insignificant items were logged from estates that were later found to contain an object of significant, often personal, value, a rare first edition book, a set of military medals, a signed photograph. These valuable items never made it to the official company inventory. It was a quiet, meticulous system of theft, hiding in plain sight, masked by the sheer volume of acquisitions. The ring, with its obscure but priceless personal history, had been his latest and most audacious swap. The realization was sickening. The betrayal wasn't just corporate, it was deeply personal. Davies had used his position, his trustworthiness, to plunder the last vestiges of people's lives for his own gain, and in doing so, he had desecrated the memory of Jinwoo's mother. The air in the archive grew cold. I looked at Jinwoo, and the guarded, powerful leader I had first met was back, but his stoicism was now infused with a glacial fury. The hidden vulnerability was gone, replaced by the chilling calm of a predator who had just caught the scent of his prey. He knew, Jinwoo said, his voice dangerously quiet. He must have researched the crest and understood its connection to my family. He didn't steal it for its monetary value, but for what it represented. He stole it to hold a piece of my history, a piece of my mother. The thought was monstrous. It wasn't just greed. It was an act of personal violation, a power play from a man who had appeared so benign. It was in that moment of shared anger and purpose that the remaining distance between us evaporated. He reached out, his hand gently covering mine on the table. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a steady, grounding warmth. "We have him, Alara," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "And it's because of you." The final act was swift and silent. The next morning, Jean Woo called a meeting with Arthur Davies, with myself and the ever-present Mr. Park also in attendance. We convened not in a formal boardroom, but in Jean Woo's stark, intimidating office, the city skyline a cold, indifferent witness. Davies walked in with an air of confident nonchalance, a man who believed he was about to be commended for his years of service. He smiled his oily, paternal smile at me, a gesture that now made my stomach turn. Jean Woo was the picture of calm. Standing by the window, the morning light glinting off the antique ring he now wore on his own hand. "Arthur," he began, his tone deceptively mild. "We've been reviewing your acquisition logs. Your work has been remarkably thorough," Davies preened. "I always strive for excellence, Mr. Kwan." Jean Woo turned from the window, his eyes as hard as obsidian. He gestured to a stack of files Mr. Park had placed on the desk. "So thorough, in fact, that you developed a system for identifying and appropriating items of significant personal value from otherwise unremarkable estates. A system of theft hidden behind negligible value reports." The color drained from Davies' face. The mask of trustworthiness dissolved, revealing the panicked, greedy man beneath. He started to bluster, to deny, but Jean Woo cut him off, his voice dropping to a lethally soft register. "You stole from the dead, Arthur. You stole from my mother." He held up his hand, displaying the ring. "This was buried with her. Your greed and your arrogance led you to violate her grave. For that, there is no forgiveness." What followed was not a dramatic outburst, but a quiet, efficient dismantling. Mr. Park, the competent enforcer, stepped forward with a file containing irrefutable proof, including financial records tracing Davies' black market sales. There would be no public scandal. Davies would be ruined quietly, thoroughly, and absolutely. He was escorted from the building by Mr. Park, a ghost before he even reached the elevator, his career and reputation erased. After he was gone, a profound silence settled over the office. The conflict was over, the betrayal avenged, but the emotional toll lingered. I stood by the desk, my part in the drama seemingly concluded, but Jean Woo walked over to me, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, looking down at the ring on his finger, then back at me. "My mother. She believed that some objects hold onto the souls of the people who loved them. This ring found its way back to me because it needed to. And it used you to do it." He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and sure. The city glittered below us, no longer a cold and distant backdrop, but a sea of infinite possibilities. The grief for what we had both lost would always be a part of us, but for the first time, it felt like a shared history, not a solitary burden. He didn't have to say anything else. I was no longer the invisible archivist, and he was no longer the guarded, untouchable boss. We were just two people who had found a piece of the past, and in doing so, had found the hopeful, unexpected beginning of a future.